Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor for Early Modern Europe, and this is our lecture on the culture of the Baroque, art and life in an age of crisis. And so in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the art and culture and changes, mostly art. We'll connect that with social changes in the 16th, early 18th century. I'm not giving you exact dates here. The Baroque can be defined in a lot of ways artistically. As you're going to see, we're going to associate the Baroque with a certain social and political transformation, of which you'll hear more in this course. But we're going to talk about these transformations through art and everything. If you don't know, by the way, what this picture is, it's using for the background of my slide, that is the Hall of Mirrors from the Palace of Versailles in France, put together by Louis XIV. We'll get to Louis XIV in a moment. So first question, what is the Baroque? You may have heard that term before, probably maybe in reference to music or perhaps to architecture. I'll give you a definition of this here first. But I'll read something for you. You're going to read in this week, or at least in the assignment, you're going to read some poetry. And I didn't assign this one for you, but this is from John Donne, the poet, who was a poet and a bishop, actually, Bishop of London, or not bishop, but he did become bishop, or was it Dean of St. Paul's at some point. I'm getting it confused. Don't worry about that. But he was a churchman at some point, Church of England. He was not raised Catholic, didn't stay Catholic, became Anglican. And he wrote this poem in 1621. It was an elegy for someone who had died. And in the one passage I'm going to read you, he'll start talking about original sin, the corruption of the world, and he'll move into something, well, as you'll see, crisis of the age. Remember, last lecture we talked about the crisis of knowledge that the Galileo affair represents. Just a little talk about this, read this passage for you first. Then, as mankind, so is the world's whole frame, quite out of joint, almost created lame. For, before God had made up all the rest, corruption entered, and depraved the best. It seized the angels, and then first of all, the world did in her cradle take a fall, and turned her brains, and took a general maim, wronging each joint of the universal frame. The noblest part, man, felt it first, and then both beasts and plants cursed in the curse of man. So did the world from the first hour decay, that evening was beginning of the day, and now the springs and summers which we see, like sons of women after 50 be. Here's the key passage. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world spent, they seek so many new. They see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son, are things forgot. For every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that then can be none of that kind, of which he is, but he. Now, why I read that passage for you is that it tends to touch on something we're going to talk about here, is that when we're talking about Baroque culture, we're talking about cultural and artistic, but also just social responses to what is perceived as a general crisis in the 17th. There's a lot of talk about crises in the 17th century among historians, a military crisis, a general crisis, a world crisis. There's a crisis of economics. There's a crisis of this, a crisis of that. As you can see from the passage I read from Donne's poem, he's thinking, of course, of what we talked about last time with the changes in cosmology that Copernicus and Kepler and it's written in 1621 and Galileo have discovered, seem to call things into doubt. And so this is an art, a form of, we'll get to culture in a second, we'll define these terms, but a culture that is responding to this. And as you can see, one of the things he picks up on there in that passage is, well, all sort of social relations are gone. Everybody's thrown back on themselves as individuals. So there's a sense of individuality in certain ways. This is true. You'll see this here. But it's also associated, the cultural moment we're talking about here in the 17th century and maybe a little before and after, with absolute monarchy. As we're going to see, and this will be the lecture coming up next time, absolute monarchy is a way of trying to deal with all the chaotic changes that have happened in the late Middle Ages onward. And you can kind of see this as a response and the art and culture that goes along with it. There are people trying to deal with these massive crises. And I should mention, I read that passage. This is the reason why historians and literary types love that passage from Donne, because it seems to like, oh, everything's doubt now. Everything's, oh, we don't, but it's actually, Baroque is more chaotic than that, because this general crisis, for example, of the Christian world, where, the universal church is now split. Again, looking back on this, a modern person might think, well, that would make them doubt the truth of, say you remain in the Catholic faith. You must think, wow, you must have doubts about it. On the other, maybe, but some people don't. Some people say, I give this example in the Catholic Church. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this is one of the great ages of Catholic missionary work. Their response to their faith being challenged is not, oh my God, maybe we're wrong. No, it's no, let's get it out there before everybody dies and they go to hell. We found these new people we never heard of before. Let's go evangelize them. So my point here is that crisis doesn't mean people lead to doubt. Doesn't mean that at all. Can do that. Does do that. There are a range of responses, and you get all that in the Baroque, actually, as a cultural moment, and definitely in the art. But it's associated with these absolute monarchies, and we'll get to that next time when we talk about absolutism. Another thing that happens is that you're having, in terms of art and architecture and things like that, the growth of bourgeois, urban, merchant class types becoming patrons of art who rival, courts, the church, the Catholic Church, in terms of, those had been the monarchs, courts, the patrons of art in the Middle Ages. Now you have in places like the Netherlands, lesser extent in England, a merchant class which runs things, and they'll be the patrons of people like, we'll get to Rembrandt in a moment. And so that's a major fixture of this. You'll see this reflected in the art and the poetry and the literature of the time as well. And of course, another thing about this is indicated in Donne's poem is a new sense of time and space. The idea, again, discoveries of the new world. All of a sudden, the world's a bigger place than it used to be. The discoveries of Galileo. It's no longer the snug cosmos. New sense of time. The idea, that you're just beginning to get, for the first time, people, they're beginning to suspect the world's a lot older than they had thought. Remember, the world's only a few thousand years old to people in the early 17th century. But you'll have people like James Ussher, who's he's a bishop of the Church of England, the Church of Ireland, which is the Irish branch of the Church of England, which is the Protestant state Church of England in Ireland. Long story. He actually is the first person to calculate using the Bible what the date of their world might have been. We get those dates from him. And so, but people begin to suspect it's a lot older. And with the coming of Newtonian physics, this will become more and more a possibility. But a new sense of these things opens up in the Baroque, which can be, unsettling. It can also be an opportunity. Some people see it that way. And so that's part of this era we're talking about with the Baroque. So let's talk about the term for a moment. Not really sure, more our historians, where the term exactly comes from. It perhaps comes from an Italian word in the Middle Ages, Barocco, which some philosophers used in the Middle Ages to describe a sort of problem or obstacle in logic that needed to be overcome. And so it came to mean any sort of convoluted idea or process or kind of thought that was a difficulty. It's a difficult thing. Kind of indicated by the other origin of the term, which is the Portuguese word, same spelling, Barocco, B-A-R-O-C-O, Barocco, used to describe a sort of oddly shaped or irregularly shaped pearl. And this term is still used. Jewelers use the term Baroque pearl. So imperfect pearl is one way to think of this stuff. And this term starts to be used in the 18th century, French and later German thinkers, to describe the art of the 17th century, usually in a negative way, a pejorative way. The idea that it's irregular, bizarre, or otherwise established from, conventions or sense of good taste, something it's odd, it sticks out. And in fact, way up until the end of the 19th century, this is the way it's used, until a man named Heinrich Wölfflin uses that term as a more of a stylistic designation. I use the question there, shock art. Is it meant to shock? And I think in some ways it is. Just these certain types of Baroque art are. It's meant to get a reaction out of the viewer. And so that's the interesting thing about it. It's meant to get a reaction. And so it's that type of, you could say it's the first type of shock art. Again, we're talking about art and culture here, but it's a culture of shock, of novelty, as well as a culture of a search for order. And there's kind of this, again, almost, I wouldn't say a dialectic, there's this tension in this period between those two things, socially and culturally. Now, again, in terms here, what is culture? And again, there are many words that have no real meaning. Culture is kind of one of them. No one's come up with a single universal definition. The definition that most people will take, going back to German philosophical idealism in the 19th century, is that is a whole, like a sort of holistic thing, collection of customs, habits, morality, laws, beliefs, particular to a given sense of society, usually in a relativist sense of the term, the idea that each culture is unique, somehow incompatible, incommensurable, somehow they can't understand each other because they're just so opaque, that sort of thing. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that than I used to be, but that's the basic idea, is a collection of how they live. But it's a real vague term, but that's what we mean by not necessarily art, not high art necessarily. That's the distinction that we need to make there. And what we're talking about here when I talk about the culture of the Baroque is cultural history, rather than say a history of culture. What I mean, I'm using my terms here. Cultural history, again, is a kind of a vague, undefined idea. My definition would be just a history of the dominant symbolism running through the art, political structures, social structures of a given people sharing some things in common, those things we already mentioned, as expressed in art and literature and ritual and the like. This as opposed to, things like social history, we're just doing studies of class, or political history, government structures, economic history. And history of culture, I mean, again, and we're going to talk about some of this stuff here, meaning high culture and its various features as a succession of changes, like a chronology of great masterworks. And we'll do some of that in here. We're going to have that as part of it. But I'm talking about things that are shared between high and low, popular and elite in that regard. Oh, yeah, that brings up another thing we have to define, is the word the people. Because what exactly is popular culture? As to, we're talking about popular, elite. Again, it's a difficult thing to do that too. Who are the people? In medieval times and in, say, colonial America, most elites, people high up the social chain, the wealthy, the well-born, tended to participate in the same types of cultural pastimes as their social inferiors. In colonial America, the wealthiest people would go to the same churches as the poorest people. In the Middle Ages, the same festivals and feasts were participated in by nobility and peasants. So, and again, I guess you could say this when this changes, when there does to be a separation between this, is a matter of dispute. A lot of cultural historians think it begins in the 17th century, in this era. I would put it later with the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution and the great revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. But at some point there will be this, but because this is, I mentioned this, by the way, because part of your assignment you'll have, not this week, you're reading metaphysical poetry, which we'll come to in a moment this week. Where next assignment, the assignment after that is it's going to be about an essay about, is Baroque culture popular? And again, you have to define the term popular, all those other sorts of things, get you to think through, because you can make that argument. I personally, because when we think of Baroque, we think of, again, you're thinking of Bach and art, you know, art music and high, and there's that aspect to it. But again, some of these art things are popular, so we'll get into that as well a little bit here. And one of the things I'm actually channeling here in this lecture is the idea of a man named Jose Antonio Maraval, a Spanish historian, who had this idea that he talked about culture, Baroque culture, as being a response to a pan-European crisis, and it being a pan-European cultural phenomenon, touching every country in Western Europe, not being merely the property of one country. He's a Spanish historian. You could trace this back to Spain in some ways, and as you'll see in some of the artistic and religious sense, Spain's at the heart of this, but it touches most countries in Europe, as we'll see. And he sees this as what he calls, quote, a general crisis of society, unquote. And moreover, people are aware of this crisis. And he's right. There are people thinking in terms of this is a, and again, we define crisis. A crisis just means a turning point. We're also talking about, things have to sort of go in a different direction. I think people are aware of that to respond to the things that are happening. And so he sees at work in this Baroque culture associated with absolute monarchies a sort of tension. On the one hand, an optimism that human effort can improve the condition of society. And in fact, this is what absolute monarchs are supposed to do. As you'll see, again, part of the question you'll answer for that essay is that absolute monarchy is popular. It's meant to be, to harness the power of the state to improve society. However, it's also a very conservative age. People are very afraid, aristocrats, kings, of disorder from below, and they have reason to be. Riots, popular outbursts can overthrow the state in the 17th century. And these aren't modern states yet. They don't have them quite yet. They're getting almost a monopoly of violent force. And so they're afraid of disorder from below. So they create, this is part of Maraval's thesis, or they participate in and sponsor what he calls a quote unquote guided culture of spectacle and novelty, channeled into pursuits that are you can call apolitical or away from the state, that don't need to upset the established order. And so he sees, and he uses this term, he calls the Baroque the first culture for the masses. And he's thinking, by the way, of urban centers, not the peasantry, but the emerging bourgeois classes in big cities in France and Spain and elsewhere. Sort of like, if you know the ancient term, panem et circenses, the Latin term, bread and circuses, it's meant to, dazzle the population, keep them in order, keep them in line. At least is his idea. But he also calls this, and he's aware that there are serious tensions, obviously, in this society, and he tries to contain, and that's part of this cultural movement, is to contain these tensions through displays of exuberance, is another term is associated with the Baroque as a cultural movement. Amazement, all this, the terms that he lists. This is Maraval, I'm quoting here, quote, the irrational, the real, fantastic, complicated, obscure, gesticulating, hand gestures, unrestrained, exuberant, frenetic, transitive, changing. And all this, by the way, in contrast to what's supposed to be sometimes described as the classical age, logical, restrained, clear, serene, calm, which would denote a classical posture. That would be later in the 18th century. Classicism in art is more restrained. You can overdo this, though, because even in the 17th century, there are more restrained, as you'll see, examples of Baroque art and architecture, especially in places like France, where there's already a lot of classicism. Classical French drama, for example, obeys the unities of time and space. That is to say, your plays are only supposed to take place in like an actual one location or a couple locations and over a period of time that's realistic or matches up. It goes back to Aristotle, but that's what we mean. Like, it's not every piece of Baroque art is a wild, woolly, maybe off-putting thing. As you'll see, I'm going to show you some art. You may not find it all that wonderful, perhaps, although I'm going to try to show you good stuff. One other thing about this, and this is something he mentions, that this is a pan-European culture. It's actually a global culture because it's going to influence all parts of Europe. It begins in Spain and Italy, more or less, in the late 16th century. But not just Western Europe, but Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, Latin America will have its own Baroque architectural, musical moment styles. And some of the stuff even gets into India via Portuguese, Spanish missions there. So churches and stuff like that. So there will be, this is a global culture. So it crosses borders and boundaries, even though it wants to, display order and things of that nature. There's all these, even at the level of the arts itself, the idea of dissolving boundaries and borders between viewer and picture, which I'll show you in a moment. All these things are characteristic of Baroque art and Baroque culture, which is very interesting. Now, I have to begin here by talking about the origins of this, because it is true that Baroque culture, especially in terms of art, has its origins in Catholic reform efforts coming out of the Council of Trent in the 1560s, as you're going to see. So that's what I mean by confessional culture. So Council of Trent in the last session, 25th session, meets in 1563, last meeting before they adjourn that council, passes a decree concerning images, because this has been one of the issues, not as much with Luther, but the rest of the Protestant reformers, that you can't use images in worship. And I'll read the passage for you, just to give this is what they say, the key passage in this. And this is the key thing here. They affirm the use of images in worship. And I'll read this here. Quote, by means of the histories of the mysteries of our redemption, portrayed by paintings or other representations, the people is instructed and confirmed in the habit of remembering and continually revolving in mind the articles of faith, as also that great profit is derived from all sacred images, not only because the people are thereby admonished of the benefits and gifts bestowed upon them by Christ, but also because the miracles which God has performed by means of the saints and their salutary examples are set before the eyes of the faithful, that so they may give thanks to God for those things, may order their own lives in manners in imitation of the saints, and may be excited to adore and love God and to cultivate piety. What happens with Trent, and people take this and run with it, is that the imagery in churches is meant to induce emotion. It's meant to get an emotional connection between the worshiper and Christ and the saints, whatever is represented in those works of art. And so it's meant to grab the emotions. This will be part of what's involved in the Baroque as well. And so churches, as you'll see, altars are built with this in mind. They are meant to grab the person, not necessarily to, again, remind articles of faith, but also to make you feel them, I guess, in a way. And this is the other thing to note about this religious art that comes out of the Council of Trent. It's meant for the uneducated laity. It is not merely aimed at the elite. It is aimed at the masses, again, kind of like what Marvel has in his thesis. This is the age of confessionalization, where you're trying to reach as far down the social scale as possible people to make sure they are properly, they keep on side in this religiously divided world. And so you have, and in some ways, the Council of Trent with its reforms, in some ways, it's kind of it's been called this, it's a little too strong, but it is a move. It talks about removing superstitions, for example, a part that I didn't quote in that decree, superstitious elements. So it's a little bit of an attack on popular devotions and their replacement by things that are meant to grab their attention. So you could see it as in that regard. But it's really meant to be a sort of, I'm calling it shock and awe. I'm using that phrase a lot in this lecture, as you'll see, shock and awe for the soul. It's meant to grab you body and spirit. And not necessarily, it's not making rational arguments. It's very different than Protestantism. It's meant to be a contrast, by the way, because in Protestantism, of course, hearing the word is more important. Although, by the way, the Council of Trent also does call for better preaching. And you'll have that, as you'll see. One of the things you're going to see in Baroque churches is really ornate pulpits, because there is going to be more sermonizing and more emphasis on it. But both mind and body in a way. And to give you an idea of just how effective this could be, I'm going to read a passage for you. This passage, this is from a letter. This is much later in time, but I think it'll give you a sense of how effective, not affective, not effective, well, a little bit of both, but affective. Because they sometimes it's said that the liturgy of the Catholic Church changed with the Council of Trent. It didn't really change. All they did was reform some certain elements out of it and made it more uniform. But they did emphasize what they did, which the only real change is they emphasized all those things that Protestants didn't like, to make a point that, yeah, we were right and you were wrong, partly, but also to engage people who were at this liturgy. Again, to give you an idea of how effective this is, I want to read a passage from the letter of John Adams, second president of the United States, to his wife Abigail. This is from October 9, 1774. This is when he goes to the First Continental Congress. If you know your American history, remember there's been that thing with the Brits, they're taxing us without representations. They just have a Congress of delegates meet in Philadelphia to see how to respond. He goes to Philadelphia, and he's a Puritan. He's a New England Puritan. He's a Calvinist. He's never, Calvinist churches are very plain. And of course, in Philadelphia, they have a Catholic population. They have a Catholic church there. And he describes in his letter what his experience was like going to this, Tridentine style mass, as we call it, in 1774. I want to read this because it's kind of great. This is an articulate person articulating this. So this is his letter. This afternoon, led by curiosity and good company, he was with George Washington, just as an aside, I strolled away to Mother Church, or rather Grandmother Church. I mean the Romish chapel. Romish is a word for Catholic, Roman Catholic. Heard a good, short, moral essay upon the duty of parents to their children, founded in justice and charity, to take care of their interests, temporal and spiritual. He means the homily, which is the little lecture on the readings of the Mass. But he continues, this afternoon's entertainment was to me most awful and affecting. And by the way, in the 18th century, when he says awful, he doesn't mean bad, he means full of awe. Here he goes. It says, the poor wretches, fingering their beans, chanting Latin, not a word of which they understood, he would have understood it, their paternosters and Ave Marias, their holy water, their crossing themselves perpetually, their bowing to the name of Jesus whenever they hear it, their bowings and kneelings and genuflections before the altar. The dress of the priest was rich with lace. His pulpit was velvet and gold. That's the Baroque pulpit. The altarpiece was very rich, little images and crucifixes about, wax candles lighted up. But how shall I describe the picture of our Savior in a frame of marble over the altar, at full length upon the cross, in the agonies, and blood dropping and streaming from his wounds? The music, consisting of an organ and a choir of singers, went all the afternoon, excepting sermon time, and the assembly chanted most sweetly and exquisitely. Here is everything which can lay hold of sight, eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell. Now, I have Catholic friends who have read that, heard that, make kind of upset about it because he's making it seem like this is all, Catholics are all morons or something. I think you're missing the point of that he's saying that stuff because those are standard Protestant responses to this, right? This is all bad. It seems to me you're missing the subtext of what I just read. He's clearly liking this stuff. He really thinks he's fascinated by it. In fact, his Puritan mind can sort of be so receptive to it. It's very interesting. And in fact, we know this is the case, by the way. in 17th century England, for example, where Catholicism was officially banned. The only place English Catholics could legally go to mass, or at least get away with it, would be the homes of foreign ambassadors. The Spanish ambassador's place, a place called Wild House in London. English Catholics in London would flock to it to go there because they had immunity, of course. And they actually passed laws trying to prevent this. They couldn't prevent it. But we know, by the way, because we have people writing about this in the 17th century, 17th, 18th centuries, that Protestants would go to these masses because they were so interested in what was going on there. So my point is, this shock and awe for the soul is really effective. The Catholic Mass, as it emerges out of Trent, is a powerful thing. Not the thing that was created in the 19th, but not the new Mass. That's not really as, this is a powerful cultural, whatever you want to call it, production, not production, it wasn't produced, they're just reforming it, but a powerful cultural symbol, if you like. So it comes out of, the Baroque comes out of these reforms, my point. You're going to have the art that sort of spins out of this. And again, the most obvious example, not St. Peter's Basilica itself in Rome, which is built before this Renaissance art, but the square, which is not really a square, constructed by Bernini. I can't remember Bernini's first name. This is the square right here. If you've ever been there, with the obelisk in the center. And you can't quite see it. This is very Baroque, gaudy looking thing, but neat, because if you can see this here, the reason why it's round is because if you look at it this way, I should have shown you an aerial view with some nice picture with the lights on. It's in the shape of a key. If you go to the end of the basilica, and the reason why, of course, is the popes make the claims that they have the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So it's done in this style, and that's Baroque, right? It's very affected, very stylized, maybe a little bit overly precious, very much in that vein in terms of religious art. This is another example of this. This is the Karlskirche. Want to say in Vienna, want to say early 18th century, I'm going to say 1720s, if I'm not mistaken. It's built, again, this is another example of Baroque art. You can see the facade, the two pillars, the two in the front. I don't know what that is, sort of decorative uses there. And Karlskirche's Catholic Church, so that's what that is there. Not quite as shocking. That's Viennese. You get outside of it, Italy and Spain, it's not quite as bright and shiny. But here's some bright and shiny things. This is the chapel high altar from the Cathedral of Segovia in Spain. I don't have the dates here. I want to say end of the 16th century. I could be wrong. And on the right, you have the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola in Rome, also in the 16th century. And again, the idea of the Catholic Mass is, the body and blood of Christ become present on the altar. And so to emphasize that fact, they make Baroque altars as gaudy as they can possibly do it. And these are almost tame by comparison to the most elaborate Baroque altars. You can kind of see the use of images, painting, gold, of course, candles, all that stuff. So you get the image here. Why I say shock and awe for the soul. And of course, this goes to the Americas. This is the Carmelite from the Carmelite Basilica in Recife, Brazil. Again, you can see it gives you just a general idea of what this is meant to do. It's in your face, in your face, Protestants. Here you go. We got this. You don't like images? Here you go. Basically, it's the art of overwhelming you with visual, sensory images, sensory data, basically. And one more just for good measure. This is because I like it so much. I like this stuff, obviously. This is the Church of San Francisco in Puebla, Mexico. As you can see, very brightly colored. And again, this is a part of that. When we say Baroque, this is the kind of thing we're thinking of, at least initially. Not everything is this, you could say garish or whatever. But thing to note here is that this is not something that remains a Catholic thing. It goes almost very quickly, within a few decades, being imitated by artists and architects in Protestant countries. Widest influences in music and architecture. Of course, maybe the greatest Baroque composer is Johann Sebastian Bach, who was Lutheran. will have influences I'll show you in architecture everywhere in Europe, even in Protestant Orthodox Christian countries, Russia, we'll get to that in a second, and even in Judaism. You're going to do in a few weeks a listening exercise where you listen to some music from the early modern period. And a few of the selections I give you are synagogue music from the 16th and 17th centuries, or I think 18th centuries, written in a Baroque style. Even in Judaism, and we'll show you in a minute, architecturally as well. It influences virtually all of these types of all of these religious bodies. Much less so when I say Protestant in Calvinist lands. It's mostly in Lutheran countries. The Lutherans are much closer to Catholics in theology to a large degree. You will not see any Baroque colonial churches in New England, at least that I'm aware of. And you will definitely not see for the most part, a Baroque painting. Few exceptions in the Netherlands. I'll get to Rembrandt and a few others. Vermeer's another one, but for the most part, they don't take the same attitudes toward the visual arts in Protestant countries. But everywhere else, this becomes, and part of it, of course, is also it goes along with, which we'll get to next time, the spread of absolute monarchy, which does not remain a Catholic. It's not a Catholic thing. It goes to other Protestant countries as well. And so, a few examples of Protestant Baroque art here. Not technically religious. This is the Apotheosis of James I by Peter Paul Rubens, who was a Netherlandish or Flemish Catholic artist working for Charles I of England in the 1630s, where Charles I was the sort of would-be absolute monarch in England. This is the from the ceiling of the banqueting hall at banqueting house at Whitehall, which I've actually seen this with my own eyes. And the apotheosis of his father is meant to sort of, venerate his father as if some sort of, because normally you would see, and I probably should have shown you another picture to give you, you'll have figures like the Virgin Mary being put in scenes like this, or Catholic kings. So this is a very Catholic use of imagery for a Protestant king to use. It's the kind of thing that made his subjects nervous in the 1630s in England, because he seemed to be, he had a Catholic wife. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was French. And so it's a very Catholic-y sort of thing to be doing, but its use is there. But mostly in music, as I said, I won't play any of that stuff. You can get some of those. I have some examples of that in the items I've chosen for you on YouTube. You can go listen to that stuff yourself. But definitely in Protestant architecture. This is Kalmar Cathedral in Sweden. The state church there is Lutheran. You can kind of see the interior. They have something that looks like a sort of altar. I don't know why. I mean, they have similar enough notions of the Eucharist, I guess, but it's not transubstantiation they believe in. But it looks a lot like, it looks kind of again. They don't have the images. They have some blacks and stuff. They have a nice Baroque pulpit, and of course, it has this nice, lovely color schemes. I like this actually. It's a little gaudy, but I like it. Right. So that's Kalmar Cathedral in Sweden. This is the Church of the Savior in Copenhagen, in Denmark. Again, another state Lutheran church from the 1680s onwards, famous for its really, really weird spire, which is kind of neat. It looks kind of fantastical. And again, has a high altar, not unlike, or not a high altar, an altar like a Catholic church, but even though they don't share the same beliefs. Again, not nearly as gaudy as those things you saw earlier, but kind of in imitation of them to a certain degree. And of course, as I mentioned, you have the influence of this even getting into Jewish synagogues. On the right here, you have the beautiful interior of the synagogue of Casale Monferrato in Italy, 1590s, and then Clausen Synagogue in Prague, in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, in the 1690s. That patterning and everything's very Baroque in that regard. You also have getting into the Orthodox world. This is the Church of All Saints, which is a part of the compound of the Prechesk Lavra Monastery in Kiev, in Ukraine. It's an Orthodox church. Again, you can see not nearly as elaborate, but you do have some work here, some little bit of stuff here, and with a nice green color mixing in with the golden domes are typically Orthodox when they construct their churches. But there is it's sometimes called Ukrainian Baroque or Cossack Baroque. I like Cossack Baroque. It sounds kind of cool, being Cossacks and everything. So you have this pan-confessional culture developing. And one of the things that's also true about the Baroque in art, but also in a broader cultural sense, is the growth, the exploration of a sense of an interior life. Now, again, Christianity has always had, going back to St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century, is a sense of the inwardness. You know, St. Paul talks about the inward man in some of his letters in the Christian New Testament, but there's an obsession with this in the 16th and 17th centuries, which you'll see across the spectrum in a lot of ways in Western Christianity. In, for example, Counter-Reformation mysticism, there are a series of spiritual, they're called the spiritual exercises, a series of meditative exercises that are created by St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, called the spiritual exercise. It's like a 30-day intensive sort of meditation on the life of Christ. You literally have to, it's partly a sort of imagistic meditation where you're supposed to like sort of imagine yourself in, you know, from scenes of the Bible in it. It's very intense. Everybody who goes to the Society of Jesus has to go through these spiritual exercises. And it becomes widely popular throughout the Catholic world as a sort of spiritual exercise. So there's this deep exploration of your soul and your conscience and your actions and stuff like this. And it's also the Counter-Reformation sees the last great age of flourishing of Catholic mysticism. Above all, in the Spanish mystics, the late 16th century. I've already had occasion to talk about St. Teresa of Avila in this course. She had a companion named St. John of Avila, who's also both Spanish Carmelites, who wrote very, very influential treatises on the soul and meditation and mystical contemplation and all this stuff. Became widely popular throughout Europe in Catholic schools, Jesuit schools, things of this nature. And so you'll have this really intense sense of interior spirituality becoming, this is something it feeds into someone like, I'll mention René Descartes later in this lecture, went to a Jesuit school at La Flèche in France, almost certainly influenced by this sort of thing, even though he's not a mystic himself. Then, of course, there's also the great age of Puritan autobiography in England. Again, England and the colonies, I kind of mentioned this last time. Puritans had to have a conversion experience and write about it. And they did. And they write about the, you know, sort of all the things going on in their soul and struggling with grace and things of this nature. Above all, the most famous of these coming out of 17th century England is the work of John Bunyan, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. This kind of follows a pattern, again, going back to Paul in his letters in the New Testament about being the chief of sinners and going through the conversion process. So you have this as a model for exploring the depths of the soul. You also have the emergence of something called pietism at the end of the 17th century, excuse me, in Germany, in German lands. In particular, what happens is you're going to have a pastor named Philip Jakob Spencer, Lutheran, in Lutheran lands, I should say. It's not a Calvinist thing. Begins to form what he calls collegia pietatis, assemblies of piety, groups of Christians who would meet for devotional and spiritual exercises. And they quickly became called pietists. Why? Because they emphasized traditional Protestant things like the, you know, reading of scriptures, but also greater efforts to live the faith and a greater emphasis on feeling, on inner conversion, but especially powerful piety, devotion, emotion. In fact, Spencer's great work, published in 1675, was called Pia Desideria, Pious Desires. So again, kind of like in Counter-Reformation Catholicism, where you're trying to emphasize the emotions of the believer, you kind of have this happening to a certain degree at the end of the 17th century in the Protestant world as well. And so there's a lot of commonalities here, despite the fact that it originates in a particular confession in this culture. Okay, so how does this stuff manifest itself? And when I talk about, you know, symbolism of a culture, what do I mean by that? I mean, think of it kind of like themes. There are certain themes running through the world, people's lives in the art and life of people in the 17th century. Or in visual terms, think of these as 17th century memes. I'm not only the half joking, because that is kind of what I'm thinking about here. Is like you have these memes are important, by the way. Memes sort of symbolize, issues and problems that people are having in society, and that's kind of what you're getting in the Baroque. And so we'll talk about a few manifestations here. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about here is display and concealment. Baroque art and culture, they love concealment display, and you've seen the display in the sort of Catholic altars I just showed you, but also in wider cultural sense. One person to talk about here is Blaise Pascal. Who Blaise Pascal was, great mathematician, inventor, scientist. He was also a Jansenist. He's a Catholic. He's a French Catholic, and I'll actually have a whole lecture on Jansenism in a few weeks by the end of this course. But it's a form of very austere Augustinian piety. It grows up in 17th century France, I should say, 17th century France. Remember anything about this course in my lectures? Don't ever say France. Say France. 17th century France, who, despite being a very rationalistic, he's a very man of his age, being a mathematician. He invents a calculating machine, essentially one of the first calculators. A brilliant, brilliant guy. He's also a great writer. He writes a series of, because we'll get to this when we talk about Jansenism, there's this big battle between the Jesuits in France and his group, the Jansenists. He writes a series of letters that devastatingly critique and attack the Jesuits. But he was also planning to write, before he died in 1662, a systematic apologetic work defending Christianity against skepticism. Because again, this is the first age where skeptical thinking about religion is becoming prominent, coming from the late 16th century. The rise of things like, Stoicism and Epicureanism lead to skepticism about ideas of the soul and stuff like this. And I'll get to the moment why he does this, but he's also an interesting guy because he had, at one point in his life, quasi mystical experience, something like this, which he never revealed to anyone during his lifetime. It's sometimes referred to as the Night of Fire, in which, the story is when he died, a piece of paper was found sewn into the lining of his coat, in which he describes this experience, where he experiences directly in his mind the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It repeats the word fire several times, what it's called the Night of Fire, where instead of this rationalistic, philosophical embracing of God, he gets this direct experience, this illumination. Never told a single soul. And so it's this hidden, there's this play of what's displayed and what's hidden that runs through, his work, the Pensées. And the Pensées are, I remember I said he was preparing an apologetic work before he died. He never finished it. All that's left was a series of notes with thoughts he had under certain headings. And some of his executors, after his death in 1662, collected these and published them as a work. And they're to this day a sort of treasured work of Christian thought. And they're amazing, by the way. They're a little bit weird and depressing. He's kind of a depressing guy in a lot of ways. I tend to think he probably suffered from depression from reading them. But these wonderful, brilliant sort of insights, these little, sometimes they'll be several pages long. Other times they'll just be a single line or two that come out sounding like aphorisms. But there's this sense of display in his works. He talks about, for example, what makes a king is having this entourage and all these things around you. If you didn't have that display, you wouldn't be a king. The necessity of display of those sorts of things, right? Anybody remember your Christopher Nolan's Batman? What does he say? Theatricality can be a powerful weapon, and theatricality and deception can be a powerful agent in the hands of the initiated or whatever. He sees that. On the other hand, he also has this idea that the truth is kind of hidden in all this. At one point, he writes in the Pensées, and again, you presume he's writing for himself, but you don't know. He never finished this, but he says, there's a quotation here, quote, "One must have deeper motives and judge everything accordingly, but go on talking like an ordinary person." I've always thought that sounded to me like, Pascal's really brilliant. Most people don't like being reminded that not as intelligent as you are. So maybe he went through that. I don't know. This idea, this contrast between what's hidden, what's displayed is really intense in the Baroque and is part of this cultural meme I'm talking about here. And of course, one of the people who's most associated with the Baroque, if you're talking especially about absolute monarchy, is Louis XIV, Louis XIV of France, right? We'll get to him definitely in detail next time, but of course he is the sort of ideal type of the absolute monarch. You see him there in his full robes and regalia. It's a famous image. I don't have my notes who did it or when, but again, this is what Pascal was talking about. Like, are you really a king if you don't have high heels? If you're not wearing like silk, if you're not wearing this stuff? And by the way, think about what that I'll get this in a moment. How much that clothing has to weigh. That looks like it must weigh 20 freaking pounds, just the sort of ermine mantle he has. He's wearing a wig, by the way. That's the other thing, right? Aristocrats, kings in the age of absolute monarchs see themselves as the natural rulers of society. He's wearing high heels, tights, a wig, and probably makeup too. But again, display. A king has to display himself, make known his majesty to keep his own people in line. And Louis XIV was the master at this. And he knew to do this very, very well. It's part of this cultural moment we're talking about here. He knew how to display himself. And we have a couple of things here, a couple of images. We'll start on the left. This is a rendering of the costume he wore to one of these court balls that he would throw with his aristocrats. Where, of course, you see, if you can see there, he's dressed as Apollo. He's dressed as the god Apollo. And, of course, the symbol of the god Apollo is the sun. And, of course, he will style himself Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, right? And you have the rays emanating out from this. And, of course, and you have it on the heels and everything. He's wearing, of course, high heels. You see, again, in the symbolism. The symbolism should be pretty obvious. But if you don't notice, why would that be a great symbol for an absolute monarch? Because you are the sun, which lightens your whole kingdom. The rays of your goodness and light and power go out from you to the rest of your kingdom. And all eyes are on you. On the right-hand side there, you have has the description there, Francois Moreau's depiction of the institution of the military order of St. Louis in 1695. But this is also something that he does every morning at Versailles. Remember, he builds, we'll come to this more next time, I'll come back to it, but Louis XIV will build his own palace, his own village, basically, Versailles, where he makes all of his nobility come there to live and attend on him. And every morning he'll have what he calls his grand lever, like he'll have an assembly of noblemen show up first thing in the morning when he gets up, when he gets dressed, when he goes to the bathroom, and they attend on him. And the whole purpose of this is to get them to focus on him as the center of things, and to see him, and to have him also, of course, so he can watch them. It's the other part of the reason, at least one of the reasons anyway. But you have, of course, people coming and bowing before him and those other sorts of things. He's on display the whole time. Of course, the only time he takes off the majority of this closing is when he goes to bed at night. He gets up at 8 o'clock in the morning. He is working until, and I'll go through his daily schedule next time. Louis XIV, whatever you say about him, worked like a dog, seriously, from 8 in the morning to like 10 or 11 at night. He's in that stuff, not this stuff, but his wig, all that stuff. That's what he's doing all day long. Again, that's what it takes to maintain this display, so that you can project your majesty to your nobility, and not just to your nobility, but to the masses, to know how great you are. Now, we'll switch to some painting here. Another example of this display and concealment. This, of course, is the work of Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. Caravaggio to you. If you don't know, you should go to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. They have, of course, the Pride and Joy as one of his works, the John the Baptist there. This is a work I've actually seen with my own eyes. This is the Calling of St. Matthew from 1599, 1600, which is in the Church of San Luigi de Franceschi. This is the French Church of St. Louis in Rome. It's still there. You can go see it if you can go there. And if you don't know the story in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew is a tax collector, meaning he collects taxes for Rome during the occupation of the Jewish land there in biblical times. And in the story, Christ calls him from the taxation to come and follow him, his taxing seat. And so this is a depiction of that moment when he calls him. And Caravaggio is a master of using shadows. Again, if you know the John the Baptist, you know this. But as you can see here, he has on the right-hand side Christ. You can see him, his slight halo there. You can see that there. And look at the shadow. Look at how it's going right down to the people in the group there, covering his eyes. You can even see his eyes barely to look really closely. And he just has one sort of hand pointing at Matthew. And most people think, by the way, it's the guy pointing at himself. It could be someone else, though. It's not totally clear, but you have him pointed like, isn't me? He's a little kid there. He's like, what are you looking at? There's another guy looking at this dude who's pointing at him. Hey, maybe that's good. No, you have all these people here. Have another person that's not even paying attention. Other guys looking down at the game they're playing or the taxes they're giving. But you have Christ used in the shadows. And like he's this mysterious figure, concealed, even though you know who he is because of the halo. The halo, it's like you barely see the outline of a halo. In traditional art, that would be, big, bright thing. You know exactly who it is. No, he's hiding. The great Christ here. And again, one of the things that that Caravaggio does, this is typical of some Baroque art, is it's supposed to look realistic, right? And naturalism is the term, right? This looks like a naturalistic portrait. It's not. It's meant to contain deep symbolism, right? The shadows do the most, light and the shadows do most of the work. This actually becomes a style people copy. It's called tenebrism, from the Latin word tenebrae for darkness. But it's just beautifully designed. But if you can't guess here, by the way, there's a symbol in here that indicates Christ's destiny, if you know what it is. Can you catch it? I'll give you a second, right? Can you catch this? Or there's a symbol you wouldn't see though. It's hidden in the everydayness of this painting. Take a look at his arm, his hand, where it's at, pointing to Matthew, and look at the windowsill. It's a cross. And yes, it's on purpose. Yeah, this is that hiddenness, right? Yeah, it's all this. They love this stuff in Baroque art and Baroque painting. But Caravaggio is one of the great masters, and this is one of his great paintings. That's 1600 or so. Toward the end or a later part in the century, you have another work. I'm not putting the names and dates on here because they're such masterworks. I want you to see them. But this is the work of a very different artist. And this is the one you call him Baroque artist from the Protestant world, the Netherlands, influenced by the Southern Netherlands. Rembrandt van Rijn, of course, the great Rembrandt, maybe the greatest painter of all time. And this is one of his last paintings. This is the Return of the Prodigal Son. If you don't know, again, the biblical story, I never tell what students don't know and know. But in one of the Gospels, I think it's Luke, Jesus tells this parable of a son who takes his inheritance, leaves his family, leaves his father, goes off and parties, squanders it all, winds up working for a pig farmer, then decides, you know what, dad's got money, I'll just go say I'm sorry. And he is sorry. He goes and begs his father for forgiveness. The father comes out and greets the son and says, oh, my son has returned to me. And he takes him in and he's loving him and all this stuff. And in the story, there's an elder brother who doesn't like it. It's like, and the father asks him, why are you so upset? Your brother was gone. Now he's back. He says, yeah, I know, but I've been here the whole time doing your work for you. You've never given me anything. And here's this worthless son of yours going off and wasting all of his money. And here you are, doing all this stuff. And the father replies, look, your brother was lost. Now he's found. Let us rejoice. And this parable of forgiveness, and it's kind of aimed at the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders in the gospel. But this is supposed to depict a very tender moment where he welcomes the son back, and you can't even see the son's face, just see the profile. And contrast this with the use of lighting in Caravaggio, whereas he's got Christ's face in darkness. You can see here the face of the Father representing God the Father, embracing. It's powerful, it's beautiful, right? But again, meant to grab your emotions. More so than I think in Caravaggio here. You have some servants over here. And in the background, I never even noticed this until I looked at this painting real close the first time. Somebody's in the background, probably a woman, maybe his mother back there, who's not even mentioned in the biblical passage or the parable. But here is the elder brother, his hands crossed, kind of looking down on him. He's looking down. I didn't like this, right? But even he looks a little bit sorrowful. And so it's this really powerful, emotional scene of forgiveness meant to draw the viewer in. So that use of light and dark, display and concealment, wonderful stuff, right? Very Baroque, as we're calling it here. Speaking of display, Louis XIV built a palace. How about build your own freaking city? How's that for display, right? And this is only one building of it. But of course, if you know, and I haven't mentioned Russia much in these lectures, but by the end of the 17th century, they're beginning to become, is Tsarist Russia, part of the European scene, Western European scene. Peter the Great, of course, famously goes to Western Europe, travels in Western Europe in the 1690s, brings back artisans, military advisors, technologists, and he wants a port which can reach Western Europe. So he builds St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. And he builds it largely, you could say, as a Baroque city. That's not too much of an exaggeration. Buildings like the Winter Palace. And they're gorgeous, by the way. There's much more restraint. This is what Russian Baroque looks like. You see it up too close. Love the bright colors, but it's a little more, it's kind of a mixture of those things. And it becomes his showcase. Again, displaying the fact that, yeah, I'm a great monarch. I'm an absolute monarch too. Can't ignore me, right? And this is, of course, one of the great things between, display and hiddenness. This is to this day, right? Is Russia a Western power? Are they Western Europe? Are they Europeans? Are they Asians? This is part of that interplay there too. So it's a fascinating thing. And he builds a city. I'm going to call it the Baroque city. I think it's so lovely, but yeah, lots of, again, that Baroque style moving, that culture moving into all parts of Europe, as you can see. Next meme I'll call, meme or theme or whatever you want to call it, is the art of amazement. Again, wanting to shock, again, shock and awe, the arts of amazement, wanting to amaze people. And I'm showing this painting, which is another Baroque painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, Judith slaying Holofernes. And if you don't know, what that refers to one of the quote unquote deuterocanonical books that are still held to be sacred and inspired by Catholic and Orthodox Christians, but not Protestants or Jews. It's a Jewish text telling the story of a Jewish widow who, when the Israelites are invaded by an Assyrian general, by the Assyrians, an Israelite widow named Judith slays an Assyrian general in his sleep by cutting his head off. And this has been a scene in art. This is Artemisia Gentileschi, who is a follower of Caravaggio. Her father was a friend of his, and she has a fascinating backstory. She grew up around, her father was an artist too, around his shop, and he had an apprentice living in his home who raped her. And that's not the part about this. Well, this happened, and she thought he was going to marry her. He never does. She actually takes him to court over this and wins. He gets exiled. I don't know which city she's in. She's in Rome at that point. But she wins the court case, and she goes on to become practically the only, as far as I can tell, well-known, successful woman painter of the entire era. In fact, she's a big hit, as you probably can guess, from modern academics for a lot of reasons. There was recently, last year, to a big exhibition of her work in London. And again, you can see the same use of light and darkness. You see their skins illuminated, and of course the gruesome cutting of his head off, and the blood spewing everywhere. And again, this is the art. If you wanted to call this, why I say shock art is one way to think of the Baroque. It's an art of shock and amazement. And this is the more gruesome part of it here, which I think is, I think she's a great artist. I know Camille Paglia, like sort of contrarian feminist author, thought she was derivative. I guess maybe in a way she is, but I think this is pretty awesome, and it's gruesome. But But she's, again, this is, and she did, by the way, did multiple pictures of Judith. She did lots of pictures, so it was definitely part of her biography, getting into these paintings. That's also, of course, again, part of the Baroque. Other things that characterize Baroque culture is, of course, a taste for the exotic. Again, you already had, tales of, far-flung continents that have been discovered. You also have, of course, the discoveries of different planets. And so what's going to happen in the 17th century is you're going to have the first science fiction stories being created, a whole bunch of them, really. And in fact, the first one's going to be written by none other than Johannes Kepler himself, the scientist. Writes a Latin work called The Dream in 1608, only published in 1634 by his son, in which an Icelandic boy and his mother learn of an island named Lavania from a demon, and it talks about how the Earth might look from the moon. It's this wild story. Another clergyman, actually, English clergyman, writes a work called The Man in the Moon in 1638, which again is another again use of this trope of going to the moon now, because you have this idea of fantastic travels. Followed up by this is actually not a novel, but a sort of speculative work of nonfiction by a guy named John Wilkins, another English clergyman, called The Discovery of the World in the Moon in 1638. Because they're speculating now about what's in the moon because of Galileo's discoveries. From the 1650s onward, however, there are numbers of parodies of this idea, starting with the real-life Cyrano de Bergerac, who writes a comical history of the states and empires of the moon. It was published in 1657, posthumously, dies before that. Later on, Aphra Behn, an English playwright, well, she, by the way, it's a woman, writes a parody of this called The Emperor of the Moon. Elkanah Settle, another playwright, writes a parody of this called The World of the Moon in the 1690s. There are parodies appearing of Francis Godwin's work into the 1750s. It's that popular. So again, the desire for, the exotic, the strange, is part of this Baroque moment, both in literature and art and other things. Just to show you, just again, what these look like: Man in the Moon from 1638, and then Cyrano de Bergerac's their front pages from their works. Again, the art of amazement, right? Oh, it's amazing, voyages to the moon, stuff like this. So science fiction begins with the Baroque. The use of what are sometimes called machine plays, especially in Restoration, but also in French tragedies, typical of the Baroque. The use of, you're talking about shock and awe, things like trapdoors, illusionistic paintings of the Baroque, which we'll get to in a moment, flying actors on strings and stuff, fireworks, is used in places like Restoration London, like play by Elkanah Settle, The Empress of Morocco in 1673, where you have mock naval battles going on. They're wildly popular with Restoration audiences, even though they get a bad reputation later on from critics because they're vulgar as compared to the more witty, more high-flown dramas. Again, part of the popular entertainments. Machines are a big part of the Baroque life, Baroque culture. I'm thinking of Versailles, right? It has a series of beautiful fountains. It's called the Marly machines, the contraption that supplies water to this. People are fascinated with machines and automata in this period as well. And then finally, a couple of things I'll only go through briefly when I talk about, shock and awe, amazement. One will be the stuff you're going to read for the next assignment, which is metaphysical poetry. And metaphysical poetry is poetry which deals with, metaphysical themes. I read some stuff from Donne. He's considered a metaphysical poet of art, life, and philosophy. But also, it's kind of shock art too, because you're going to have people like Donne using shocking metaphors to refer to things like love. He writes a love poem called The Relic. And it has to do, again, he means by dead bones. Again, it's a weird thing to do. Well, it's this idea where you're trying to think through new things by being shocking and risque. came to be looked down on in the succeeding century, in the 18th century, as being kind of uncouth and out of place. And actually, the name comes from the poet and critic Samuel Johnson, who wrote a series of work called The Lives of the Poets. And in his life of one of these metaphysical poets, Abraham Cowley, this is a famous passage. I'll read what he says about the poets here. He says, quote, "Metaphysical poets, a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. Of wit thus defined, they have more than enough. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises. But the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased." And as you'll kind of see, this is not necessarily always it's not very lovely sounding poetry, because it doesn't scan well, because you have sentences breaking off in the middle of a line and stuff like that. Some of it will. But part of the reason I gave you these poets is they're thinking through some of this age of crisis in verse. Others aren't. Others are doing more playful, like there are poems in there that are called oh boy, carpe diem poems. I hope I don't get canceled for this, but carpe diem poems are, there's a genre of poems usually associated with cavaliers. Cavaliers are sort of like people that are on the side of the king during the civil wars versus the king in parliament in England. But carpe diem poems are, how can I put this? They're poems addressed to mistresses or girlfriends, trying to convince them to have sex. Like, carpe diem means seize the day, and the idea is we'll be dead tomorrow. Let's be happy today. That's what these poems are. They range from the high philosophical seriousness to low vulgar stuff. That's why I include them in the Baroque. I also love them. I think they're great. I think it's great stuff. Some of the poems, by the way, are wonderful. Especially John Milton, the great Puritan poet, had the best ear in the English language as a poet, as far as I'm concerned. So, not all Discordia concourse, which is one of the other ways he refers to a concourse of discordance, basically, is what Johnson describes him as. Very Baroque. And then finally, I won't mention this in too much detail. You'll have some examples of this in the assignment on music, but Baroque opera. If there's anything more Baroque than opera, I don't know what it is. If you're talking about something that's over the top, affected, I confess I don't like opera very much. But of course, it begins in the 17th century with Claudio Monteverdi and his successors. It combines, several genres, so it crosses boundaries in that way. Music, dance, and poetry. But of course, it's way over the top, and I've been to see Mozart operas. I like the music, but not the hugest opera fan in the world. And in fact, Baroque music in general, you'll listen to some of this stuff. I think it's lovely. It takes some bit. I didn't like it when I first heard it. Thought it was off-putting. Again, it's very affected. It's very, all this stuff going on. Why is this stuff here? Like, you're raised on, pop music. It's just good. It's just good melodies, right? But there's a lot more going on in Baroque music and operas. I'll leave it at that as the best example of that, as far as I can give to you. But finally, the last theme of Baroque life and culture in the 17th century, 18th century, early 18th century, is what I'm calling altered states. I mean, altered states of perception. You have this sense, because of the changes of, look, it turns out classical thinking was wrong about, say, the number of continents in the world. New peoples being discovered, new planets, all these things changing. Different perceptions of what human beings are, different perceptions of the world, of the self. And you're going to have this probably illustrated no better in terms of philosophy than anyone else than in René Descartes, the great thinker and founder of modern rationalist philosophy, who, if you don't know, wrote a couple of famous works, The Discourse on Method in the 1630s, and then Meditations on First Philosophy in the 1640s. And he's famous, of course, for that idea, you can doubt everything, but that you're doubting, that you think. I think, therefore I am. So this is like in the religious sphere, there's this intense sense of interiority, intense sense of well, he's going through a period of like crisis, right? The crisis of knowledge. His method is sometimes referred to as epistemological doubt. All that means is he's using doubt in a sort of systematic way to try to not prop up, but try to discover what he can know for certain. And because again, he has this idea, and actually he tells the story in some of his early letters. He has a dream. He's actually with one of the armies fighting during the 30 Years' War, and he's in his tent, and he says he has this dream. It's kind of a thing that sets him off on this journey of doing his philosophy, but it's this idea of, again, not being able to know what's real and what's not, whether you're waking or dreaming. This stuff runs through not just his philosophy, because that's what the discourse on method he talks about is like. How do I know when I'm dreaming whether I'm really dreaming or not? Right? Like, how do you know what you perceive as real becomes an obsession because of all the changes going on? And so this sense of, okay, what do you have to do in order to get your perception straight again? On the other hand, of course, art actually encourages that to a certain degree, which again, we have this in literature in spades in the 17th century, in the same time frame that Descartes' writing. These are mostly plays. Talk about this. You know your Shakespeare. If you don't, remember his play The Tempest at the end of his career, where he writes about Duke Prospero, who's been exiled to an island, where he does what? He practices magic, and he puts on a magic show for the people who are shipwrecked there, right? And it turns out at the end, it's all just an illusion. This art of illusions, again, a powerful thing, what's real and what's not. This gets into the work of some of the Spanish masters of the Golden Age. This is the Spanish Golden Age of literature, the early 17th century. Most famously, Art of Illusion in Miguel de Cervantes' great novel, Don Quixote, if you haven't read it. Again, if you know what it's about this this Spanish nobleman who loses his marbles by reading romances about chivalry. The idea being these ideas are so crazy, if you take them literally, you're a nut job. And it's like a precursor to the idea that you'll become violent if you play violent video games, I guess. But anyway, he goes off on all these adventures thinking he's a knight errant of the Middle Ages, meant to mock all this stuff. And if you've ever read it, it's a fascinating work. Be a slog for you to get through as an undergrad. I don't think you could do it. But the first half of the book is written in 1605. It's just about him going around doing crazy things, tilting at windmills. The second half of that book is almost a comment on his readers, because what happens in the second part is there's more of this realization this poor guy's mentally ill, and he's going around. He goes around. He runs into this Duke and Duchess, and the Duke and Duchess have heard about him in Don Quixote, and they want to keep him at their court so they can make fun of him. And it's really depressing, the second part, because basically it's like, you people are awful for wanting to make fun of this mentally ill guy, but it's very much playing with this idea of illusion. And by the way, I won't give away the story, but he comes out of it at the end of Don Quixote. Again, life is a dream. Pedro Calderon is one of the great playwrights of the Spanish Golden Age. I won't dwell on this stuff too much. Gets into French theater as well. Pierre Corneille, the great tragedian of the French theater, writes Illusion Comique. 1630. So you have this idea of perception, what's real or not, becoming a meme in the 17th century. Another way you have this, and this is very popular in Baroque painting, obviously, is trompe-l'oeil. I think that's how you pronounce it. Trompe-l'oeil, whatever. It means trick of the eye, literally the French word. And it's about optical illusions in painting. This is the Palazzo Farnese, Loves of the Gods. As you can kind of see, you have all these paintings here. It's meant to sort of be, this is on the ceiling, obviously, but it's meant to be images. You have a painting up there, you have a frame there. The idea, of course, that you by staring at this, you lose your sense of perception, and the frame sort of dissolves. And you don't know if, what if we're in a picture too? And that's sort of, it's meant to be this trick of the thing. It's very, in some ways it's clever, in some ways it's really cheap. That's an example from a palace. This is an example from a church. This is the Jesuit church of Vienna, and also another example of trompe-l'oeil. I believe that these parts are metal and they're real. Everything else is a painting. Those are not real domes. These are not real scenes. There's just, it looks like it's all going upward. It's not. It's just an illusion trick. Again, very strange stuff. They love this stuff. Altered perceptions, altered states. This is from another palace, another residence. In residence Würzburg, in Würzburg, Austria, 1720s onwards. Again, you can kind of see this up here. If you look real close, I don't know if you can see this, you have all this plaster work up here, and you'll have these white figures here are actual figures. The rest of it's a painting, but if you look at it from a distance, you can't tell the difference. And again, it's just this idea of like where the frame ends and begins being dissolving. Again, this is altered perceptions, altered states. They love this stuff, and it's of course part of what they're responding into in this age. And then finally, last altered sense is an altered sense of course, what society is and it's like. And this emerges in what definitely a theme of philosophy in the 17th century. It's a state of nature. You've heard that. Well, definitely talk about that next week when we talk about absolutism and the social contract. You can probably trace this back. You can trace this back to the discoveries of the New World peoples, right? And you have, if you don't know who Michel de Montaigne was, he was a nobleman writing during the French Civil Wars, wrote a series of, essays, like literally essays. What they mean, like essay, it's not just a short piece of nonfiction. It means an attempt. It's him trying to think through all of these ideas. And he writes a famous essay called Of Cannibals in 1580 in his first edition of his essays, in which he speculates, we all think cannibals are awful, but like, you know what? Everything's just about custom. We don't think cannibalism's good because of our custom, but if, think about how the cannibals must think about us. They must think we're weird because we don't eat people. It's this sort of relativistic way of thinking about the world. The skepticism brought on by events, the religious wars, the discoveries of the New World and everything. But it brings into relief an idea of what is a state of nature and what is human society. Because what's going to happen in the course of the 17th century, and I'll get to this in the next lecture on absolutism and social contract theory, is that up until the 17th century, people had thought society is a natural thing. We naturally have government. We naturally form hierarchies. We naturally come together as associations of people. Well, you're going to have people in the 17th, 16th, 17th centuries like Jean Baudin, most famously, however, Thomas Hobbes, who begin to think, well, that's not quite right. In fact, it's Hobbes actually really invents the idea of a state of nature. And as you're going to see, there's a peculiar background to this. They're going to say, no, in a state of nature, we're actually just live in chaos. We live in a war of all against all, says Hobbes. And we have to create order out of that. We have to create what we call society. You could use the word civilization, create laws. They don't occur naturally or spontaneously. And from Hobbes, then the later thinker who comes in the same line of thinking, John Locke, you'll get the idea that no, nature is something, society is something artificial. You have to create it. That's where you get contract theory from. Because if we don't, it doesn't just happen. You have to have these, it's an invention, right? It's no longer seen to be natural in that same sense, at least by these thinkers. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave off for today in this lecture on the Baroque. But just want to go through all this to give you a sense of this isn't just, politics happening. And when I ask about these things, when I ask that question in the essay in the next couple of weeks, you have this culture that's being, that's meant to, on the one hand, explore the nature of the crisis that's going on, maybe even revel in it to a little degree, but also concerned to create order where an order seems to have broken down. And that's going to lead us into next time when I talk about absolutism, because that in political terms is going to be the corollary of this. Yes, we had this traditional order. We tend to think of absolutism as being a traditional thing. It's not. It's a novelty. It's a response to the crisis of the 17th century and of the early modern period, in just the way a lot of the art and architecture and literature is that we've just talked about. So that is it for this lecture. You guys got some information out of this. If you're wondering when we're going to get to the old politics and the war stuff, we'll get that in the next few weeks. So I thought you get a little taste of cultural life in the 17th century. So thank you guys for listening. Until next time, have a good one, you guys.